Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's really a true honor to be here tonight, and it's really great to see such a great and enthusiastic crowd. I'm Jonathan Metzl from the Vanderbilt University Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. I'd like to welcome everyone to the panel discussion tonight, Triggering the Debate. I first wanted to thank the Institute for Public Knowledge for hosting this event, and so thank you to Sam and Jessica, and really a terrific crew, and David, everybody who's been involved in publicizing this event. So it's really great to see such a great community out here. We have a terrific panel tonight, and I'll be introducing them very shortly. What we're going to do is have about 10 or 15 minutes per panelist, and then hopefully we'll have some time toward the end for questions. Thank you all for a slightly delayed beginning tonight. We were waiting to get the TV set up, or it'll be publicized on NYU TV, but we'll go until 8:30, so it'll give us hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. Let me first get started by just framing the issue a little bit about what the impetus was for us for presenting this panel tonight. So as everyone in this audience absolutely knows, we've come through a tremendous time of national reckoning about guns and gun violence in the aftermath of the terrible tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. And in the aftermath of that horrific event, please come on up. There's seats up here in the front. There's some seats there on the side. You guys all good there? There's a couple seats right there. And in the aftermath of that tragedy, in which not only did 20 children and 6 adults lose their lives, but there really was a national awakening at that time about this issue potentially has gone too far. And the question of where was it that we were going to go from there really was part of the national conversation. And in the press conference that President Obama had about 2 days after the Newtown shooting, he basically made an argument that this time is different, that in a way, even though we've had tragic shootings in the past, that something about children being shot in schools and seemingly safe schools that had safety plans in place seemed to be a point where, even though this was a very fractious divide, that we could all come together as a nation and somehow resolve this issue of gun violence, or at least make some starts into what had been a very polemicized debate up until that point. Now, as people know, that didn't exactly happen, and even though there was a national reckoning and a national soul searching, a lot of the debate that happened in the aftermath of the tragedy really has pitted, it seems like, if you kind of turn on the news, two familiar sides against each other. One side saying basically we need to limit guns and have gun control now, and the other side saying that this is a constitutional issue and nobody's going to take my guns, and really what we need is not fewer guns, we need more guns. And I think that the part of the reason why we're having this panel tonight is really to get a handle on a lot of the anxiety and fear and anger that have surrounded the question of guns in the aftermath of this tragedy, part of which is valid. I mean, I think that when something like this happens, we certainly have a national reckoning of this sense that something really crazy is out of control at the time. Now, for me, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and it got to the point where even though people were kind of running around and thinking about guns and talking about guns, I had actually some dental work done, and I went to the dentist, and my dentist had a gun in his holster while he was cleaning my teeth. This maybe doesn't happen in New York, but it did happen in Nashville. And my first thought was, I don't want you to confuse that with the Novocaine pen. But then I said, why is it that you have a gun? What's going on there? And he said, well, Obama's going to come and take our guns. And I said, well, did you have a gun before? And he said, no, actually, I just went out 2 weeks ago and bought the gun because Obama's going to take the gun. And now definitely that made me nervous going to the dentist is not fun in any case. But there is this kind of national kind of paranoia that somebody was going to take this guy's gun when he didn't even have a gun in the first place. And so there are these inflamed, as we know, passions on all sides of these issues. And at the same time, I do think that there's optimism in the sense, at least we'll hear tonight, that we need to do something, and that this moment also is an opportunity for change if we move forward. And part of the caveat of why we named this panel Guns in Relation to Mental Illness and Race is not that everybody on the panel tonight is going to be talking about race and mental illness. They're going to come at this issue from very different perspectives. But I think the issue is that there are certain, we might call them stigmatizations or misperceptions that glom onto the discourse of guns that are important for us to think about as we move forward, if indeed we want to do something. And the first is this question of mental illness. Now, certainly in the aftermath aftermath of the Newtown shooting, there were a lot of debates about what was the mental illness that Adam Lanza had. Did he have schizophrenia? Did he have Asperger's disorder? And that was something that was played out in the national media. And of course, for anybody who saw the really interesting, using interesting with quotes around it, NRA press conference right after the shooting, that whole press conference was all about there are crazed, insane killers on the loose, and we need to get guns out of the hands of demented criminals. Now, it wasn't just there. Also, people probably saw the Ann Coulter statements that came out afterwards that said if we're going to do anything about gun control, Coulter was saying, guns don't kill people, the mentally ill do. So that's on one side of the debate. And as people here know very well, on the other side of the debate, there also has been a question of what is the real link between guns and mental illness. And so certainly that's been an issue in terms of thinking about mental health screening, and that's certainly a part of the successful legislation in New York that was linked, among other things, to this question of asking psychiatrists to potentially pick up in advance patients, mentally ill patients, who might have access to guns and who might be dangerous. Now, certainly these are all very important things, and I'm not going to say as a frame for this panel that a lot of the mass shooters haven't had some very serious mental illness issues, and certainly that's something that we need to take account of. But I just want to complicate this point very slightly by saying that even though there is evidence, Mother Jones did a great article and showed that 38 of 62 of mass shooters have had some kind of mental illness symptoms. So certainly that's important, but I would also warn against pathologizing the mentally ill as an aggregate group. And I think a lot of people who are mental illness advocates are making the same point, which is that if you look at the mentally ill as an aggregate group, less than 3% of gun crimes are committed by persons who are diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, according to Paul Applebaum at Columbia, and fewer than 5% of the 120,000 gun deaths in the National Center for Health Statistics were caused by people with mental illness. So numbers that are actually lower than the national average. The vast majority of people with mental illness do not commit violent acts. And there's actually a pretty interesting body of literature that shows that if you're diagnosed with mental illness, your chance of committing a violent act is actually lower than the national average, because a lot of people with illnesses like schizophrenia and serious depression end up staying at home or being socially isolated or withdrawn. Now, there was a great study done at the USC School of Social Work, and they tracked gun violence in the Los Angeles area. And what they found was, at least over a 5-year period, if you had mental illness and you were involved in a gun crime, that your chance was 60 to 130% greater if you were diagnosed with mental illness, that you were going to get shot than that you were going to shoot somebody else. And so, in a way, this popular stereotype, I just want to say, this stereotype of somebody with mental illness as kind of running loose on the wild, is at odds with, I think, something in the real world where people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of violence. And people who are now writing about this point say that there's some rationale that's needed when we talk about mental illness in relation to guns, because the arguments I think people like Jeff Swanson at Duke are making is that we are looking at rare acts of violence, homicides committed by strangers against other people, and large mass killings. And what we're not doing is actually looking at the more everyday kind of shootings that aren't linked to mental illness. And so basically what people are arguing is that there are a host of risk factors for gun violence, but it's not psychiatric diagnosis. For example, we know that substance use, independent of a psychiatric diagnosis, increases the risk of a shooting 7 times. That's true in a lot of places. In my home state of Tennessee, you can actually have a loaded gun in a bar, so I think about that every time I go into a bar. But just the presence of alcohol increases the risk of gun violence. A past history of violence is another strong predictor of violence. There's interesting research coming out of Harvard right now that shows that actually knowing someone is a risk factor for violence. I'm saying this slightly tongue-in-cheek, except that there are these great studies that are being done at Harvard now, and they look at social networks, and I'll just point out this second number down here, that 85% of all gunshot injuries in a high-risk area, people were shot not by crazy people on the loose who were attacking them, they were shot by people they knew. So in a way, looking at social networks might be a more useful line of inquiry than looking at mental illness diagnosis. And of course, we know from Mindy McCready's tragic story that access to firearms is a great risk factor. And so the point I'm trying to make quickly about mental illness is that the population-based literature suggests that if we're asking psychiatrists to diagnose people with mental illness, that in a way we're looking at one risk factor, but we're overlooking other risk factors that aren't linked to mental illness and mental illness diagnoses. The second point that's linked to the framing of this is the stereotypes of race. Now, for people who have been following the NRA debate about the so-called Colin Noir, who is the spokesperson for the NRA, and basically the NRA website is now showing a man whose name, I guess, is Colin Noir, who is advocating guns for African Americans. It's the lead story on the NRA website now, and there's a big debate going on about that. And the point is also here as well, we need to kind of complicate and think. I mean, certainly it's a bad idea to advocate increasing guns in inner cities, which he's calling himself an urban warrior. But there are other ways in which this is problematic, and part of the issue I've been writing about it this week is that there's a long history of cultural representations of angry black men with guns that have been used by society. And so we know, for example, that there are all these representations of Malcolm X, the representations of the Black Panthers, and people who know this history, Robert Williams, Negroes with Guns in 1962, a whole host of cultural representations in the 60s that basically told this very complicated story about cultural anxieties about race getting played out in relation to the rhetoric of guns. And I don't want to belabor the point here except to say that there were a lot of representations at the time, but part of what we saw in the 1960s was not just a rush toward gun control. We also saw a tremendous rush toward the anxiety of white society trying to buy guns in response to this cultural symbol of the angry black man with the gun. And so if the NRA is promoting this symbol on their website, in a way what they're promoting is a very historically laden stereotype that I think we need to think about at least as we move forward. And so the take-home point of this brief introduction is just that I think the point of the panel tonight is that guns are very complex symbols. And when we talk about guns, we're talking about a lot of things, but it's not just like we're talking about the denotative gun we hold in our hands. That guns are imbued with a whole host of stigmatizations and fears and anxieties that might play out in a way that got my former dentist to go get a gun. But people know this, and it's being debated on all sides. So certainly the NRA is promoting a lot of these stereotypes, but even well-intentioned efforts are still thinking about guns in relation to their symbolic pasts. And what we're doing tonight is really trying to move forward from this debate. And Jeff Swanson says that the problem we've done with mass shootings in the past is that we've built common evidence from uncommon things. His argument is that we've built policy based on these mass shootings, but we haven't really looked at the everyday gun violence as a way of setting our gun policy. So we're predicting this kind of a black swan event, but we're not predicting the everyday thing. And I think what we're trying to do now is, as we move forward, to build common evidence from common things, and in a way to say, like what they're doing in Bridgeport, for example, and other places, how can we control everyday violence? So with that as a preamble, I'm really honored and delighted to introduce our panel today. We'll first hear from Jose Serrano, who's the state senator from the 29th District of the South Bronx, and really has been a leading advocate against guns and promoting gun control in New York. After that, we'll hear from the terrific Joyanne Reid, who's the managing editor of the excellent Griot.com, an on-air contributor to MSNBC, and really has been doing a lot of work in this area as well. After that, we'll hear from Mayor Bill Finch from Bridgeport, who, among other things, has been a very vocal advocate in Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and also has championed a very important gun buyback program. After that, we'll hear from Lauren Lataro, who, for people who've been following this on Facebook, has started this Artists in Support of Gun Control, and really has been doing some fantastic activism, almost public art performance, trying to raise people's awareness about guns. And finally, we'll hear from Gary Belkin, who is a psychiatrist here. He's the director of the program in global mental health at NYU, and he'll be talking a bit about the public health approach to guns and gun control in the global perspective. So please welcome Senator Serrano.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jonathan. It's really an honor to be here with all of this, all of our panelists. It's really a wonderful group that you've put together to talk about this really important issue. As you mentioned, I'm State Senator Jose Serrano, represent the 29th Senate District, which covers geographically a very diverse area. It's the South and West Bronx. It's also East Harlem, Upper Yorkville, Roosevelt Island, Central Park, and the Upper West Side. So we see Republican gerrymandering at its best in creating a district which is quite easily the most diverse in the state of New York. But there's a lot of common threads throughout this district, and especially when it comes to progressive issues such as gun control. On the state level, in the state Senate, you've seen that we've recently passed the New York State SAFE Act, which is a sweeping reform of the way that our state deals with guns and gun ownership and the hands of who can have guns and so on. It definitely has brought about some passions, to say the least. And I'm seeing that on a regular basis up in Albany when I'm there. I just came back last night. But up in Albany, there's been a major pushback to what we've done. Now, the response to the shooting in Connecticut, there's been a nationwide outcry for us to do something, us being elected officials to do something. But long before that, being that I'm from the South Bronx, being that I fully understand what guns, especially illegal guns, have done to our community, we have been calling for stricter gun laws for many years. And oftentimes it would, there would be very little movement, there would be very little support, especially amongst the Republican legislators who, again, as you're hearing now, viewed any kind of curtailing on gun ownership or some sort of common sense gun approach as a real slap at the Second Amendment and taking away constitutional rights for gun owners. But when you consider the devastating effect it was having in the South Bronx and in East Harlem, the amount of lives, especially of young people, African American and Latino, that were being lost to gun violence, the numbers were just astronomical. So it became one of the cornerstones of the work that I was doing when I was first elected into the New York City Council back in 2002, and then when I went to the New York State Senate in 2005, was to find ways to strengthen and bring about a real common sense approach to gun ownership. As we heard Jonathan mention, there's this unfortunate oversimplification that you'll hear from a lot of opponents to gun control as to the root causes of gun violence. And like he said, the mentally ill are the ones who are to blame, and so many other factors. Or really, we're only talking about a very small percentage of people who fall into that category who actually get involved in unfortunate gun crimes. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of gun crimes are committed by people who have no prior history of this sort of behavior, that there's no real warnings that I think anyone could be able to grasp anything meaningful from. So to me, it had always boiled down to there are just too many guns out in society. It is just too easy to get them. It is too easy for the wrong person or any person for that matter, to have guns in their possession. So my whole issue was that in our society, in this day and age, there really should be less guns out there. And Mayors Against Illegal Guns is a great organization that is trying to stem the root of the problem, especially when you consider how easy it is in other states to get guns without any background checks and bring them into New York and into poorer neighborhoods in New York City. So, the rest of the panel will talk a lot about their areas, but from my point of view, from an elected official's point of view here in New York, this has been an ongoing issue. This has been something that has been devastating communities in the South Bronx and East Harlem for a very long time. It's unfortunate that it took sort of these mass shootings in areas outside of the South Bronx and East Harlem to gain the national attention that it probably always should have been. But be that as it may, after Sandy Hook, you saw a major national outcry, we need to do something. So Governor Cuomo, to his credit, put together in short order a comprehensive gun control bill that was not filled necessarily with new ideas, but with things that advocates like myself had been pushing for. It contained legislation that had already been introduced years before, and it was just brought together in an omnibus bill that really did, I believe, a lot of good things. Since then, there's been major, major backlash. 2 weeks ago up in Albany, a huge rally against Governor Cuomo, and they said that he's taking away the rights of New Yorkers, and responsible gun ownership is really the foundation of our society. Basically, a lot of code words in there to say that if we don't believe in protecting everyone's right to own guns in any fashion that they wish, whether they be assault rifles or not, that we're basically un-American, and we just don't get it. And I think that's such an unfortunate discussion and it always sort of goes back to that. I think it's painfully ironic we have President Barack Obama who is pushing for, on a national level, at least some common sense approach to guns, and right away he's seen and vilified as a person who is trying to destroy the Constitution, take away our rights, take away our ability to defend ourselves against a tyrannical government, something they point out quite a bit. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion, and it will be continued for a long time. I think it's going to be played out for quite a while. But from a state government point of view, it's been an uphill battle. But I give Governor Cuomo a lot of credit for doing what he's done in taking the bull by the horns and doing something about gun violence in New York.
Okay. I'm loud, but I'll get closer anyway. Hi, good evening. How are you? My name is Joy Reid. I am from thegrio.com. If you're not familiar with us, we are a division of NBC News that focuses mainly on issues of interest to the African American community. I want to first of all thank Jonathan for the invitation. I really appreciate it. We actually met on the Melissa Harris Perry show on a panel, and we'll be on one again tomorrow, so just a little self-promotion. You guys can turn in, watch MSNBC tomorrow, and you can see both of us again. And I also want to say how great it is to meet my senator. This is actually my senator, and it's odd because he's my senator and my godmother's senator, and we live so far apart that it takes me like an hour and a half to get to her house. And the fact, gerrymandering, man, that's a whole nother panel. So, it's great to meet all the panelists. Great to be here. So what we a lot of times do at the GRIO is sort of talk about the racial dynamic of all of these debates. And so not to get too much into the wonky history of it, but I speak for the nerds, so I have to do it a little bit. If you look at the sort of gun debate in the country or the attitude toward gun control, there always has been something of a racial component. If you go all the way back to when the founding fathers, the revered founding father deities were creating the country, there was this big debate about the Second Amendment and what to put in it. And part of that debate was informed by the fact that the southern states that they wanted to bring into the Union were very concerned that if there was not a right to bear arms that included the word militia, a well-regulated militia, and if that word wasn't in the Second Amendment, that their militias would be outlawed. And what were their militias for? They were for the recapturing of fugitive and escaped slaves. So this idea of the Southern, these sort of militias that they had put together to make sure that enslaved black people couldn't get away, and that they could have armed militias to hunt them down, was very much a part of the formulation of the Second Amendment from the very beginning. So there was this compromise that changed the original language of the Second Amendment to really spell out that a well-regulated militia being necessary to a free people. Because originally, the way that the founders envisioned the Second Amendment was just saying, just very broadly, that the right of the people to bear arms should not be infringed. But this well-regulated militia part was very important. And it's kind of ironic that now you have a largely Southern opposition to any sort of gun control, and they often leave out that part that was the most Southern part of the Second Amendment, the part about the well-regulated militia. They just basically like the second part that says the right of the people to bear arms, meaning you can have a Uzi or a howitzer, or you can have whatever you want, and that the government can't stop you. But there was always this vision that there would be some regulation. That's the first thing. And then when you kind of look at the way gun control evolved in the country, If you lived in Tombstone, Arizona in the 1800s, you couldn't bear your arms and keep your gun everywhere. When you came into town, in towns like Tombstone, Arizona, you actually had to check your gun in at the sheriff's office or sometimes at the local saloon. You certainly couldn't go into a saloon with a gun. That was illegal. And in fact, I think it was the Battle of the OK Corral, one of the most famous gun battles in American history, had to do with a gang, I think it was a Clancy gang, whatever the name of the gang was, refusing to surrender their pistols, and the sheriff attempting to enforce gun regulation and gun laws. Even if you go into the early 20th century, during the 1930s, when you had this rash of violence in Chicago by mainly Italian-American and Irish-American gangs, the rest of the country was so terrified about these marauding Irish and Italian people all over the place that people were very supportive, including the National Rifle Association, which had been more of a gun club, sort of shooting club kind of organization, but it actually was on the side of the idea of gun control. And there was a very strict law passed that made it illegal to possess certain kinds of machine guns and certainly to transport them. Going even forward into the 1960s, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, there was this fear of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were this terrifying menace. Jonathan mentioned it a little bit. And what they were doing was they were following police armed. They had their arms, showing, and they were following police around to see what they were doing regarding black people. Were they doing illegal stops? Were they harassing people? And they were sort of watching the police. And of course, police didn't enjoy this, didn't like it. And so Ronald Reagan was a huge champion of what's called the Mulford Act, which made it illegal to carry your guns in public or in your car. So this was Ronald Reagan, who is the saint of the Republican Party, conservative, pro-gun. He was very much for gun control because it was about regulating the Black Panthers and keeping them from bearing arms in public. So it's very complicated, sort of the relationship of the NRA to the idea of gun control, because they used to be really much for regulation. Even Wayne LaPierre, who now just says crazy things on TV for a living, he used to be for universal background checks. I think he's testified before Congress in the past saying they were for this because prior to like the 1980s, gun control was largely seen in its relationship to minority communities, whether it was Italian Americans, Irish Americans, African Americans, Latinos. It was always seen as a way to control populations that the majority of the country felt uncomfortable being armed and being at least openly armed. And I think now we're seeing the same thing with the mentally ill, that there is this group of people, we all presume that every one of these mass shootings, it is somebody crazy, so we have to regulate them, and there's this zeal to regulate that. And what happened in the 1980s is that the NRA split and they formed this PAC, this political organization whose job mainly is to represent the manufacturing industry before Congress, to keep regulations from making their costs go up, and to make sure that they maximize gun sales without inhibition. So the kinds of things the NRA has been successful at doing is things like stand your ground laws, which the purpose of them is in a lot of ways to limit the liability of individual gun owners if they use their gun. That makes gun ownership more attractive. They have this broad immunity that the NRA got passed in Congress that means that you can't sue a gun manufacturer, so that if a certain type of gun like the Bushmaster, the what we call the AR-15, is used all the time in crimes, the families of Newtown, for instance, can't go and sue Bushmaster. They have this blanket immunity, and they also have something unique to every other kind of company that contracts with the Defense Department. Normally, if you contract with the Department of Defense, you still possess the same legal liabilities when you're doing your everyday business, but not the gun industry. They are unique of all federal contractors that they are unsuable as a federal contractor. So the NRA has been very successful over the years in shielding the gun industry from any kind of economic harm. And the gun industry has a challenge. Overall, gun ownership in the country is actually not going up when you count the number of people who are buying and owning guns. Shotgun sales, pistol sales are sort of flat, but the number of guns has skyrocketed. There's probably like 2 guns, I think, for every human being in the United States. There's lots of guns out there, but what's happening is that people who already have guns are just buying more, and the kinds of guns that they're increasingly buying tend to be more toward the semi-automatics, the AR-15s, because hunting is flat, but this idea of like the survivalist thing, right? Where gun shows are not just a show where you go and look at guns, they've also got this component of running out into the woods and pretending you're in the military and you put on fatigues, and that kind of gaming, the gun gaming sort of industry is very, very popular, and it's what's growing. So you can see the economic incentive around holding on to semi-automatic weapons has to do with that being where the sales really are. And at the same time, the NRA goes back to those same tropes about scaring people into thinking they need more of them. So in the 70s, it was this big push about women. Girl, get your gun. You know, guns that are great for girls, that are smaller, cuter, they're pink, they've got a pearl handle, and really selling them to women because that was a growing market. And it, you know, whereas before that it was about hunting, it was selling them, hey, go out with your kid, teach them how to shoot, that kind of thing. Now the idea behind selling these guns is all about terror, fear. The government is coming to get you. The government is going to take the black helicopters, take them over your house. They're going to confiscate your guns. There's going to be a zombie apocalypse. Everybody's going to be running wild. Your neighbors are going to be coming in stealing your canned food. You're hoarding your gold. They're going to steal your gold. Like, they're making this whole terrifying apocalyptic American scenario that is all mixed up with race and scary brown people and scary black people. And so that helps gun sales. So you have to always look at the pragmatic reason behind why the NRA might be doing the crazy things that they're doing. And Rachel Maddow at MSNBC has done a lot of talk about this, which is very important, that when you hear Wayne LaPierre just saying absolutely insane things on TV, part of what he's doing is keeping you focused on Wayne LaPierre. Because if you're focused on him, you're never thinking about the company Cerberus that owns Bushmaster. And you don't have your advocates, people like the state senator, focusing on maybe we should divest our state pension from that company, because that's what's happening that they're really afraid of. States like California, movements in Colorado and places to do divestiture, to actually make the gun manufacturers toxic. And I'll wrap up by saying that there is a huge movement in the country right now that is changing the nature of the debate. And it has to do with finally somebody stepping up with the same amount of money or more than the NRA has, and that would be Michael Bloomberg. You know, love him or hate him, Michael Bloomberg has changed the entire game in terms of the gun control debate, because he was willing to spend as much money as it takes to take that A rating from the NRA and make it into a scarlet letter for politicians. And this played out in Chicago when poor Jesse Jackson Jr. Had all his problems and was indicted and had to, you know, his seat is now vacant. And in that House seat, the woman who was actually the front runner, and of course I have her name, I'm gonna forget about it, but the front runner in that case has an A rating, had an A rating from the National Rifle Association. She was expected to easily win because she had name recognition, she had everything that it took to win. But she was actually ultimately beaten by the person who's now expected to take over the seat, and her name is Robin Kelly. And what Robin Kelly had going for her was an F. She had an F rating from the NRA. She was the nightmare candidate of the National Rifle Association. So the A rating is supposed to win. The F rating is supposed to lose. But what Michael Bloomberg's organization, Mayors Against Illegal Guns, did is they spent about $2 million, which is a lot for a primary, to literally brand Debbie Halverson, that was her name, the A-rated candidate with the scarlet A from the NRA, made her so toxic, because in Chicago, people are dying not from mass shootings, but from everyday day-to-day murders, everyday day-to-day killings that are destroying and decimating the community. And so he took what people are experiencing in their real lives, inner city gun violence that's partly to do with the lax laws in the neighboring state of Indiana that is bleeding guns into Illinois. And he took that and he made people think about that. And when they thought about it, they decided, nope, we don't want Debbie Halverson, and now she's not going to be a congresswoman. So I'll wrap it up on this point that we need to start thinking about the gun debate not as the crazy antics part of it, but as the underlying reasons why NRA and others are doing what they're doing. And the only way to fight them back is to, in a sense, shame them and then outspend them. And if people want gun control, you're going to have to vote, spend, and shame the other side into compliance. And that's all I have to say.
Oh boy, I took a few notes. I want to thank the organizers for asking me, and I'd like to thank Mike Bloomberg, because without Mike Bloomberg and Tom Menino, we wouldn't have Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and it's about 850 mayors now that represent, you know, all the people who live in those cities. And, you know, I was recently asked to introduce the vice president when he came to Danbury, which is next to Newtown. And what I said was, I want to say to you, mayors are sick and tired of burying our young people. Every time we go to a funeral, we think, wow, that kid, maybe he really could have been something. And it's a tragedy. What's it, 33 people a day in the United States are killed with guns. I think it's a lot about political power, and I think it's about supply and demand. political power because you need to elect people like Senator Serrano, who will stand up in Albany against the NRA influence, against the people who come out with a lot of beards and a lot of plaid shirts. I mean, I've been there. I was a state senator for 7 years in Connecticut. We had an assault weapons ban in Connecticut. Governor Malloy is now working very hard to get almost as good a bill as you and Andrew Cuomo have passed, Governor Cuomo. It isn't as good, and you've got a great guy here that's really stuck his neck out, and you have to support people that stick their neck out on issues like that. It's all about counting votes. You know, we have to be able to get the people with the F ratings to get elected. I had a D once, I think, but most of the time I was an F. I'd like to just say that the Mayors Against Illegal Guns also is very much like mayors. You know, we're Ds, we're Us, we're Rs, and there's no Democratic way to fill a pothole, and there's no Republican way to catch a bad guy. So, you know, we look at things very pragmatically. How do we stop the violence? And we really need a community-based approach, and that's the only thing I think that ever works, is a community-based approach. I get a kick out of the people that get on television and talk about the mental health issue. I'm sure it's a contributing factor. I'm sure of that. We all are. But it's looked at wrong. You know, we've got to look at it as a community mental health issue. In the African-American community of boys under the age of 30, there's an epidemic of violence. That's not 10 people, that's hundreds of people in my city. And what leads to that, you know, we know pretty much what leads to it, but I think one of the things we're most excited about is Professor David Kennedy at John Jay has come up with a model that it's sort of like a roundup model. You find out who all the 300 or 400 bad guys are in the city of Bridgeport. And we're a very small city, by the way. My city's smaller than his state senate district, but it's the largest in Connecticut, which gives you a little idea of all these quaint towns like Newtown. The whole state is quaint, you know, except for Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven and Waterbury. We're gritty cities who deal with about 80% of all the social ills in the state. So we're like a big city, even though we're small. And the thing that we see, even though we're doing it in our community-based outreach, we've run Take Back the Night walks, where we have 500 people and we march with candlelight through the poor neighborhoods and the areas where there's been shootings. We've done those. The faith community is very, very important. They can mobilize a lot of people. And we have noticed that for whatever the reason is, 4 weeks after the march, things are a little calmer there. And I don't understand it, but I know it helps. And we don't have any, pardon the pun, silver bullets in this argument. But we know that community policing really is very important. When our police officers are engaging the citizenry in their everyday life and instituting community policing, that really helps a lot. We've created a Safe Corridors to School, where shopkeepers, moms and dads, the crossing guards, and the police department all work on these corridors where the children walk to school. That's been very helpful. It keeps it top of mind to people. We are going to be doing a gun lock giveaway, and we're going to do it with the American Shooters and Sports Foundation, which is a Second Amendment advocate. Because we're going to do it because we're going to do whatever it takes pragmatically to keep people safe. And gun locks work. And if they were mandated to be on every gun, and Adam Lanza didn't have the key to the gun lock, he wouldn't have access to the gun because it would be locked. I would like to say a little bit, based on my experience as a state senator, just for a second on the Second Amendment. You're not going to get rid of the Second Amendment. Not going to get rid of it. We may wish we could. It's never going to happen. Not politically pragmatic. However, we can whittle down the number of guns that are in society, and we can have common sense legislation. And I talked earlier, right, about counting votes. One of the most important things we have to do is reach out to the hunters. I know a lot of hunters, and Mayors Against Illegal Guns has surveyed hunters. Hunters are generally that sort of Reagan Democrat that we lose in elections, that Jose and I are going to have difficulty keeping, because they think we're going to have those black helicopters and agents sliding down on ropes to take their gun. We all know that's crazy, but they have been living this relationship with the NRA for a long time. It's a bit difficult to break it. So what I did when I was a senator was I fought really hard for a couple things hunters wanted. I don't hunt. I'm an outdoorsman. I fish, but I don't hunt. I know many people who hunt. And just, if you don't know, hunters keep their weapons. I don't know a hunter that doesn't do this, so I'm going to make a blanket statement. But hunters keep their weapons in a safe in their house. And gun safes are big business. We probably ought to raise some money from them for gun safety measures. And then they keep the ammunition locked somewhere else. And I think, was it 85%, Brian? 85% of gun owners who are NRA members agree with criminal background checks. One of the things mayors against illegal guns has been pointing out is where states are weak and where they're strong. Connecticut, for example, is very weak when it comes to making our mental health records and other records available. It does seem to me that we miss a real simple issue, and I touched on it when I first started. It's the supply, right? I mean, if the supply of guns, 40% of the guns in the United States are bought without a background check. That's 6.6 million guns a year bought. We don't know who bought it. Now that's just nuts, right? So there's guns pouring into the streets of Bridgeport and Newark and Trenton, New York. And in order to control that, we have to raise the prices. We have to raise the cost of getting a gun by giving more and more information out through a background check. And so the one thing we got to guard against is this argument that always is, well, you know, criminals are always going to find their way to get a gun. Well, yeah, but 33 people a day are not all being killed at the hands of criminals necessarily. You know, if guns are less plentiful, there'll be fewer suicides by guns. If guns are less plentiful, there'll be less domestic violence deaths by guns. There may be more contusions from baseball bats, but there will be less gun deaths if the supply is reduced. That's just, I think, irrefutable logic. I don't know that that fits in Washington, but irrefutable logic with city councils can work pretty good. So the other thing I always like to remind people, there were 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. They passed long after we had a country because everybody trusted James Madison to figure it out, and he did. And they've got this Second Amendment. But, you know, the one thing I remind my gun advocate friends is it's not any more important than any of the other parts of the Bill of Rights, right? And if I had looking at a barrel of gun, I don't have any more rights. Every right under the Constitution is suspended when I'm looking at the barrel of a gun. So they can't oversell the Second Amendment. It's important. It's equally important to the other 9 in the Bill of Rights, not more important. So we're doing a community-based approach while we talk about all the polemics, and those are very important because you've got to get good laws, and we don't have good laws to, you know, tamp down the supply. We just had a gun buyback. We raised, right after Newtown, Bridgeport is about 15, 20 miles from Newtown. In fact, my police chief lives there, drives by the school every day on his way to work. So there were a lot of people. One of my teachers was the mom of a child who died. We shouldn't be a nation that has to identify 6-year-old victims through DNA because there wasn't enough left to recognize them. That happened 20 miles from Bridgeport. So we've been doing this all along, and we're energized because of Newtown, but we would have probably continued doing everything exactly that we're doing anyway because we've lost too many people. We lose between 20 and 30 people every year to gun violence in the city of Bridgeport. We're only 150,000 people. The Conference of Connecticut Municipalities has put together a plan, and there's a couple things that are kind of new. I'd just like to mention them quickly. One is to prohibit the sale of body armor in the United States, or at least in Connecticut. If you're a gun owner and you're trying to protect yourself, and that's one of the legitimate reasons why you may own a gun, you can't have those Second Amendment rights if somebody approaches you with a weapon and body armor. You no longer have a right that's protected because you can't protect yourself. We also are trying to get the legislature to give each of the municipalities the right to prohibit the shipment of ammunition on their roads. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution precludes states from regulating the internet and other sales, right? But it doesn't stop a town from being able to put a fine on someone delivering something on their streets that's prohibited. We don't know if it's going to hold up or not. but we're really trying some creative ways to get at areas that states and cities can't regulate. We've recently merged our school police and our city police to have a greater community approach. And we really have a pretty good bill taking shape in the legislature, so if there's anybody here from Connecticut, please support Governor Malloy. I think the legislature actually wants to go a little bit further than the governor proposed, so that's good news. We're going to continue to buy guns back. Ironically, the first day of our first gun buyback, the first gun in the door was a Bushmaster AR-15. It just gave us the chills. But we've raised over $100,000 from private sources, wealthy individuals and companies. And like I said, mayors are pretty pragmatic. We even took it from the coal plant, you know. We need to buy the guns, and we make, you know, community-based responses. And I'd urge everybody to think of things we can do together at the community-based level, because that, I think, is what's working the most. The best.
Hi, I'm Lauren Lataro. Jessica, I'll let you deal with PowerPoint since they didn't teach it at Juilliard. I'm a dancer on Broadway and a choreographer on Broadway. What am I doing here? You know, I'll start with a story. When I was in 4th grade, this happened. A boy who had been bullied for years came into our classroom with a leather whip and a huge knife, crying and screaming and saying he was sick and tired of being bullied. Whipped our teacher across the face. I have a scar on my arm from a knife wound. We were huddled in a corner, screaming and crying. 2 6th grade boys heard the sobs, ran and got the gym teacher. The 3 of them came in, saved the day, tackled Jimmy. Police came. That's what happened in 4th grade. Today, Jimmy and I are friends on Facebook. He has a family. He has kids. He is successful. He is healthy. He is happy. You know, he did what he had to do through therapy and whatever, but that happened. If he had had a gun, I'd probably be dead. Jimmy would probably be dead. So maybe that had something to do with all of this and my reaction to this. But art and activism go hand in hand, and I feel like as an artist, what I'd like to do today is just talk to you about reframing something. So you guys can take care of this. You're articulate in all of this, the rules, you understand this so much more than me. But what artists do is we're stealth-like, and we can come in from another angle and sort of surprise attack. And that's what I'd like to do for this cause around the country, right? I mean, Tony Kushner is a friend. I did American Idiot on Broadway. When you're around people like this is how they think. Brecht, Joan Baez, Keith Haring, the Yes Men. I'm a huge Banksy fan. This is what these people do. They sort of stealth-like, and they come in and surprise you in a very sort of visceral way. So that's what I tried to do. So what exactly did we do? It wasn't a rally, and it wasn't a protest, and you millennials would call it a flash mob. I call it an act. So on February 24th, about 200 of my friends and I went to Times Square, and we held our hands up in the air for 26 seconds. Then we slowly dropped to the ground, and then we held our hand right above our friend's heart for 26 seconds. And then we took chalk, and we drew around each other with chalk, and then we wrote a word in the body, and we walked away. And we were left with a sort of sea of like a literary sea of corporeal deaths. I mean, it was really, really powerful. And inside the words were words like senseless and loophole and mother and son and enough, first names of victims, ages, first names of victims since Newtown, children's names. What I wasn't expecting was the response. It was unbelievable. Times Square, for about 15 minutes, was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody talked. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Nobody walked on the bodies. It was really, really more powerful than any of us expected. And then national response followed. Rachel Maddow and Steve Colbert and the New York Times, Section A, and for the last 2 weeks, every day there's been another phone call. So it really moved people in a deeper way, and I think that's what art can do. My goal was to reach at least one person undecided. You know, in the crossroads of America, it was sort of a metaphor for what's happening in America, to sort of have a response to these things. There's no way that you can just hear rhetoric. This was, the shouting and the surrounding and the saturating of gun control rhetoric sort of shuts people off. And I just wanted to have this image that opened people up, right? And that's what we do as artists. That's where art comes in. Joseph Conrad says, the artist appeals to the part of our being which is a gift and not an acquisition, and more permanently enduring. And the spirit of an artist's gifts can awaken our own. And this is what I wanted to do. By tapping into another part of the brain that doesn't think in red and blue, I feel like I can penetrate people's emotions in a different way, right? Because art just affects us differently. Look at Gabby Giffords. She has difficulty speaking, and yet the woman can sing a whole Beatles song without thinking about it. So it really does hit us differently, right? You know, the other thing about this debate, we keep talking about bad guy, good guy. So I just want to talk, like, I just want you to be actors for 1 minute. One of the things you learn in acting class is that there's no such thing as an antagonist. There's no such thing as a bad guy, right? The first thing you do when you're playing a bad guy on TV is you play your super objective, what you want. You think you're the good guy, right? Darth Vader, that's why he's the greatest bad guy. He thinks he's the good guy. So these prisms of right and wrong are so liquid. I'm not even talking about the NRA, I'm talking about us. Now add a gun to that equation. So if you're a Hatfield, you're sure the McCoys are wrong, right? If a bump in the night, it could very well be your girlfriend, which is what's happening right now in the news. Egregious behavior can happen like this on a bad day, and you know the difference between having a gun and a baseball bat is a scar and being alive. Look at my 4th grade experience. You can even just switch it there. The antagonists weeks earlier were the very boys who saved the day. Those were the bad guys, right up until the moment that they saved the day. Those were the guys who were bullying Jimmy. And Jimmy was the victim for years. We would sympathize with Jimmy if it were a TV show, right up until the moment that Jimmy came in wielding a knife at his teacher. So things flip, and we all play antagonists and protagonists in life. In one scene and in 1 minute in life, we go back and forth all the time. So for me, I don't trust any of us with a gun, me included, because at every minute of the day, these things shift so quickly. And as an artist, we understand this and we hone in on this and hyperbolize it, right? Another thing that I'd like to share with you as an actor is one of the things you do in prepping for a Broadway play or a dance is that we learn each other's roles, okay? It's an exercise older than Shakespeare. It's meant to elicit empathy and round your understanding of the story. So if I were to take LaPierre's crazy speeches and say them out loud, I would understand them very differently. And if he were to take my speech and say it out loud, he would understand it very differently. So yes, we have to fight this. But just, again, to just sort of come in the underbelly of this, I'm going to ask us all right now to do an acting exercise. I'm going to ask you all right now to do the uncomfortable trying on of the other, okay? Feel how it might feel to believe that something is being taken away from you. Now, I understand that this doesn't make any sense in the real world, that a gun kills and your grandmother's diamond ring doesn't. But I want you to take an object. Everybody, think of something that means something to you, your favorite book, your coat, your car, your grandmother's diamond ring that you love. Think of something that has real meaning to you, okay, that you love. A Picasso that your grandmother got before everyone thought he was a genius, whatever it was, anything. Think about it. Have this object in your head, okay? And now imagine somebody saying you can no longer have it, right? Now think about what this does to you. Again, I understand that this is an incongruent object, a diamond ring to a gun, but the feeling is what I'm trying to get at. The feeling is the same. To the people who are worried and have fear and anxiety about losing their guns, that's all they care about, and that's all they're feeling. So feel what it feels like for a second. Really, think about this. If somebody's taking something away from you that you believe they're taking away from you, something you love, it does something to your body. And this is where I live, in the corporeal realm, in the physical realm. It makes you stiff, so the anger makes you stand hard, dig your heels in, right? It actually changes your physicality. It changes the way you talk. So this is what's happening. So we're sort of doing this, and what I want to try and do is let that, unhinge that and let the other side feel that same thing that I'm asking you to feel right now. So when the other side comes and sees this art that we're trying to create around the nation, it's beyond words. It's visceral, it's physical. And there's no way, from what I saw happen in Times Square, that people can actually just shut down. You people were gasping. I mean, there's some stuff on YouTube where some girls were filming and they were whispering, what is happening? I can't, oh my gosh, it's their bodies. I mean, silent. This was Times Square, and people were talking like this. The cops everybody was amazing. And so this is what I'm trying to do, is get beyond the words, let all these guys do that, and let us artists come in and blow this up, and let the media blow it up, and we sneak attack. And have one person, 5 people, 10 people go, oh my gosh. And then let the opposition try and do it. It's funny, one of the Newsday comments were, oh great, look at all the dead bodies on the ground. So many, exactly. Like I dare the NRA to do it and have because it's still victims. So it's sort of, again, you can rhetoric, you can talk, but at the end of the day, it's all bodies. Good guys, bad guys, it's all death. And that's what this thing ended up doing. The other thing I learned, and I want to just say, there's so many young kids here. I never did anything like this before. And I have no proclivity towards political action. I read the New York Times, but you don't, this is as good as it gets. Sometimes the Wall Street Journal if I'm feeling erudite. But, you're not stuck reading the op-eds. You're not stuck just reading what, Christoph is doing to save the world. You actually can do something. And I was so scared. I walked into the 54th Street precinct, and I'd never done this. I've never been arrested. I'm not really comfortable around police, to be quite honest. I walked in. I was like, hey guys, I'm thinking of doing this protest. I'm a dancer on Broadway. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Do I need a permit? No, actually, if you have you don't need a permit. It's your right. It's your, Really? I can just do this? Absolutely. What day do you want to do it? What day do I want to do it? I want to do it next Sunday. Great. What time do you want to do it? Can you put one of my buddies' names in? It was a huge lesson. I'm embarrassed to say that it was a huge lesson for me to learn that I have the power to do this. And I have just as much power as LaPierre. Really, I was on Rachel Maddow. I was in the New York Times and not getting a bad review this time. It was great. It was great. But you have this power, so what I want to do now is go through the arts communities and colleges and let young people in America sort of feel like they have the autonomy and the power to have their own voice. So that's what we're trying to do, and we're already doing it in Chicago in 2 weeks, in Philly and in Boston, and
Bridgeport.
if anybody else wants to do it anywhere, I'm happy. So we're sending them the money and we're sending them the information, and that's what we're doing. The last thing we did was I gave out the words, and on the back of the piece of paper I wrote the switchboard number, and you have to call and then give your zip code, and everybody went home and called. So that's our other sort of what we're trying to do. So next time in Chicago, we're actually going to hand out flyers and write the phone number in chalk and hope that the media picks up on the phone number. And so we're trying to really get a specific message about calling your congressperson and telling them what you want. So that's what we did. We made a video. Sorry.
Starts at exactly 1:08 in Duffy Square, and it takes about 3 minutes to do, and we'll leave the chalk marks there until they clean it up. It'll be over in moments. I'm just going to give you an overview. The only choreographic events will be this. We slowly sink to the ground. One person will go all the way down to the ground. The other person will hold their hand on the heart. We count to 26 by ourselves. We'll chalk the body, and you will get a word. First names of the children. There's words that hopefully elicit a response. Put the word in, and then you switch partners, and that partner lies down. You chalk me, and then we get up, and we will walk away. Should we try it all together? Let's spread out. like as artists we understand that, and that's our job. That's what we do on stage every night. We try to change people's minds, and we try to open their minds. One person walks by and we change one person's mind, then we've done our job today.
So that's what we're trying to do.
Oh my gosh. So Jonathan, I'm going to forever hate you for putting me after that. You know, it just brought back to my own mind the paralysis I'm sure many people felt after seeing the news about Newtown. And I actually saw it late in the day and was just sort of embarrassed that I'd gone through the whole day not knowing about it. And was in tears, and I think any parent would be, and the way that this reconnects you to things that, you know, to people you don't know, is really powerful. And so I'm one of those wonks, so I have to announce that ahead of time. But what I want to talk about is how we're not only can easily become reconnected to people we don't know, but how hard it is to become, through things like this, much better connected to the mentally ill and to the idea of mental illness. And I'm going to circle back to things that Jonathan brought up at the outset. I'm a psychiatrist. I oversee mental health services in the New York City public hospital system. I also am at NYU, as Jonathan mentioned, developing projects in developing mental health care capacity in low-income countries. Any editorial comment I give about anything like the new New York State law is not in my capacity in New York City. But you know, it seems to take a mass shooting or a death or a suicide death of a celebrity to get mental health to be widely discussed in the media, and usually in a very unintelligent way, which tends to push it aside somewhere. And if I can have, or I could stand up, I can go. In a really unintelligent way, because it just tends to push it off somewhere, as does the New York State law for you know, mass shootings, which is such a rare occurrence. To have to now, for every mental health professional, every physician actually in New York State, to have to register anyone who comes into their office who they think you know, may be dangerous to themselves or other, to have to register them is just an ignorant understanding of what mental health care is about. And so, and I think it starts with this idea that they are the mentally ill, and I want to push the point that actually, you know, we are the mentally ill. These are data from the last Global Burden of Disease study, which calculates years of loss to disability. That is the cumulative time for a given disorder that you're going to be out of work, that you're going to be out of social role, that you'll be impaired, that you'll be unable to do what you need to do. And each color is for a different sort of group of disorders, and the red is mental illness, mostly depression, bipolar disorder, and addiction. And so you don't have to really need to know the specific numbers, but just to see the red, that's the burden of disability in the population in the world today, and it's probably, the red is probably magnified in developed countries, although it's also pretty prominent and increasingly so in developing countries. And so that's you know, that's a lot of us. And I really liked your metaphor about good guys and bad guys, because we tend to talk about mental illness as some fixed thing, some ontological thing that doesn't change over time, that's easily identifiable, rather than very ubiquitous, fluctuating presence in the population that if you drop incendiary devices into that sort of percolating and complex set of mood changes and substance use and you know, is just going to ask for trouble. So what I want to talk about is how we can think more if we grasp that the problem of mental illness is actually a deeply embedded and widely distributed one that could hit any of us unpredictably. Then we really have to rethink about, you know, what mental health care is. And I hope someday, after some event, we might talk about mental health care more intelligently in that way. If I go to the next, so this is comparing the accessibility of guns versus the accessibility of mental health care. If you may not have noticed at the top, if you could, is your typical provider, data from the U.S. is that the odds of anyone walking around with very common, probably most common mental disorder, major depression, the odds of getting evidence-based care are maybe 1 in 5 in this country, maybe a little less. So not only is, and people who are identified as having a disorder when surveyed, most have not received care in the prior year. So a lot of that red is just people sit with. Next, so we have to really reimagine, I think, if we're going to change that equation, then we have to rethink this whole kind of idea of what access looks like. Next. This is a map of the density of the population that has been, or the portion of the population that has been in jail. So it's really a density of parolees in New York City. The darker the red, the higher the density. And I was looking at this map one day, and to get to your point about, really community strategy around these things as the new normal, not as a response to crisis, but as the new normal of how we think about mental wellness and mental health. I was looking at this map, and I realized this map is probably going to look very similar to a map of the density of drug abuse, of high school dropout rates, of single-family headed households, of other kinds of violence, of HIV, of poverty. And it also occurred to me that this looks very much like the map of the coverage area of the New York City public hospital system. So we have, in fact, mapped a resourced, capable resource, mapped really over this dense web of pathologies that brew mental illness and violence and frayed communities and trajectories that don't turn out well. But we don't leverage that capacity to have that kind of impact and reach deeper into communities and be part of more population-based solutions. And that's how we have to think about mental health. There's good data that mental health conditions and outcomes are intimately connected with all of these other outcomes and determinants. Whether you're going to complete high school, whether you're going to keep a job, early childhood and developmental trajectories are firm predictors of downstream mental health issues, the built environment, features of your neighborhood, the community, the either frayed or organized, efficacious or disorganized communities. So if mental health is so ubiquitous, next. Mental health is so ubiquitous, but as the point I made earlier, we design mental health care to be so incredibly siloed and hard to get at. So we really have to reimagine how mental health care happens where it's needed. So if you go back to if you think of the New York City map, I've been looking at some of those neighborhoods and talking to folks who are returning from jail and asking, we did focus groups, what makes you go back to jail, cycle back through jail, reoffend, and people identified things like resumed addiction, depression, poor social and family supports, things that we know about, things that we can actually do a lot about, but we're not meeting them where they are. We're not designing, we're not imagining our capability to provide that knowledge and provide that care. So I've been working, for example, with community groups. I don't know if people are familiar with the Ceasefire program or Cure Violence. And basically we decided to train them in evidence-based psychotherapies. So and we piloted this in central Brooklyn, and they loved it. They're a very psychologically minded group of ex-cons who really become kind of street-level big brothers to gang members. And so we've really skilled them up and made them the first points of contact in a pathway of mental health care. They're much more credible. And And so it's that sort of really leveraging, imaginative leveraging of existing social networks and capacities and communities to be providers of care, to reimagine who's a provider of mental health care that's really critical. And I actually borrowed that idea from working with community health workers in places like Haiti and West Africa. This is a team in Haiti and Partners in Health where we took community health workers and we started training them up in mental health skills to do counseling. This is in one of the tent cities that arose after the earthquake. Saw 20,000 people in about a month. And what you do is you create access where there was no access. You create a system of care that's evidence-based where there were no specialists by rethinking the community as an arm of care. And in fact, this is a slide from a friend of mine, Vikram Patel, who's been a real thought leader in global mental health, and is saying, you know, in developing countries, we really need to rethink who can do care because you have one psychiatrist for 40 million people or something. And you realize that you don't need specialists to provide mental health care. You don't need elaborate mental health systems. You can really reimagine how to make that care accessible. So he came up with this acronym of some of the principles that came out of these kinds of health worker and community-based approaches called Sundar, which is Hindi for attractive, I think. And so they're really to simplify the message. We complicate what disorders are, what they mean, how they happen, so that they're almost inaccessible to people to really understand how to come up with solutions in their own life. We need to really unpack the treatment. If you think about any kind of disease, let's say HIV, there may be 10 steps to good care. You need to have a test to find out whether you have it. You need to have some kind of key marker that you follow to see whether somebody's getting sicker or maintaining their health. You want to educate the patient about how to maintain and comply with healthy practices. You want to give medication, et cetera. 8 out of those 10 steps you do not need a physician for, you don't need a specialist for, and we're learning and working in developing countries you can unpackage mental health care that way. You can sort of break down the parts of a pathway of care for depression or addiction and find out that what you're left with are sets of skills that lots of people can do. So let's have lots of people do them. And that's part of delivering it where people are, making it more affordable, and using specialists where those first steps fail, and to really coach those more empowered people in communities to be successful at being the first responders. So this way of thinking about mental health systems leaves open the possibility for mental health care to be less about treating identified, marginalized, cordoned off mental health people, and actually contributing to much broader social capital building and human capital building. I don't know if people are familiar with this idea that's growing. I don't know if it'll fully flourish, of measuring population happiness as an alternative or an addition to economic productivity and other sorts of metrics that, how much happiness is a society producing? And it's an interesting idea, and there are actually some pretty good and simple ways of measuring it. But what it does is it challenges us to think of, okay, well, how do we move that metric? How are we creating the ways of working with communities to do that? I've become very interested in an associated idea called mental capital, which captures very tractionable, actionable, concrete ideas and measures and interventions to maximize cognitive development, emotional well-being, to capture that whole repertoire of mental capabilities that we want to enhance in the population as a purpose of policy, as a goal of mental health systems. And if we succeed in that, and if we identify those sorts of targets as our goals, rather than just treating the mentally ill, I think we'll have a lot less gun violence to show for it.
Okay, well, we're just going to wait a second and turn the lights up here. We have time for question and answer. But while we're waiting for the lights to go up, I'd just like to give the panel another round of applause for just considering. just take questions from the audience, please? Sam, we get the lights? Perfect. Yes, sir, in the back.
I'm originally from Connecticut and Bridgeport. I live in New York City, just 10 blocks from here. And my question concerns the leader of the mayor's group, Michael Bloomberg. The picture that's portrayed of him, is it a totally fair portrayal in terms of his success in New York City in tackling the gun problem? I would point out, number one, not only has he contributed successfully in the Chicago race, but his dollars have secured Republican control of the state Senate, and state senators, Republicans, opposed to gun reform legislation. And two, what about the crime-fighting strategy here? It's not community policing, it's broken windows courtesy of Rudy Giuliani, marijuana possession, stop, question, and frisk, targeting blacks and Latino kids with very little evidence that guns are being taken off the streets as a result.
Okay, I think maybe we'll start with the Senator who might have something to say about that.
Well, addressing the first part of your question about Mayor Bloomberg, yes, he's done a tremendous amount to raise awareness for the issue. He's put his money where his mouth is and actually rallied many other mayors towards this cause. But in the state Senate where I represent, yes, it is sort of the Bloomberg paradox because progressive, Democratic senators like myself in the Democratic conference, the regular Democratic conference, do not receive that level of funding from Mayor Bloomberg. He does support the Republican conference, which is kind of counterintuitive on this issue because the Republican conference has been historically against any stricter or tougher gun control laws. So in the state of New York, one of the biggest impediments that we've had over the years to things like micro-stamping or safety locks on guns, and these are some of the legislation that I have in the Senate or co-sponsor of, has been the Republican majority in the state Senate, which is now a coalition government, but again of conservatives, that take the side of the NRA because they're heavily funded by the NRA as well. So I think it is a little bit of a paradox when you consider what the mayor has done throughout the country on this issue, but in the state Senate it seems to be a little bit skewed. So I really don't, it's hard to sort of reconcile that in my head. I have a good relationship with Mayor Bloomberg, but on this one issue I strongly disagree with the way that he's handled his politics, and I think that he'd be much better served since even though he is an independent, formerly Republican mayor, but really he is quite one of the most progressive on many issues. On this issue, he's been, I believe, wrong. And before I turn it back over, I just wanted to jump off one thing that Laura was mentioning. I thought it was so interesting when she was talking about the arts and the role that artists could play on this issue, which is sort of a non-traditional role. I'm actually spent a good part of my life, 6 years of my life, working on the other side of this building at the Public Theater. So before I became an elected official, I worked in theater, in off-Broadway theater. How I became a politician after having worked in the arts is beyond me. Maybe we can get some mental health advocacy. But yes, my first job out of college was at the New York Shakespeare Festival. And as Laura was mentioning, there is really that's one of the incubators of social justice is the art scene. And that's why in my role as a state senator, I advocate for the arts and culture. I'm the ranking member on the Cultural Affairs Committee. The arts are my passion. Because on issues such as guns or other issues that are of critical importance to so many, the artists are the ones who are willing to do and say the things and have the courage to do and say the things that so many of us are still searching for. So it sort of plays into this whole notion of culture on this issue of guns, not culture in the artistic sense, but sort of culture on who we are as human beings. Because when I have the folks with the hunters and the folks with the plaid shirts or whatever, that they come to my office and Serrano, you're from the city, you have that silly bow tie, you don't know anything about what upstate hunters care about. This is a way of life. This is responsible gun ownership. You're from the Bronx, you don't know anything about that. Now, I may not be a hunter, but I'm definitely an outdoors person. I mean, I do a lot of great hiking and camping. That's my passion as well, and state parks and so on. But, you know, this whole notion that we, as folks in the inner city, or maybe they know about my arts background or whatever, they just assume that I don't get it, that I just don't understand it. And that's why it's so important that we sort of diversify the conversation and make sure that we have a real diverse group of people talking about the need for sensible gun control. It's far more diverse than we think, and I think that's important.
Right?
If I could just somewhat answer your question and jumping off of what the senator said, Bloomberg is, I like the way you coined that, the Bloomberg paradox. He is a paradoxical figure. I mean, I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, not far from where the Aurora shooting took place. Actually, the mall we used to go to was right near there. But I moved back to New York during the Giuliani era, which for African Americans was the low point, really, I think, in relationships between city government and the African American community police. It was just a nightmare. Giuliani was so cold toward the community and just had no compassion when there would be shootings, particularly if there were police-involved shootings. So to me, there is no comparison between Giuliani and Bloomberg. Bloomberg is a saint compared to Rudy. Just my own opinion, not speaking for NBC or the Griot. Giuliani was a nightmare for black people, and I think for Latinos. He was just not compassionate as a human being. Now, you know, Bloomberg, the stop and frisk law has become a very toxic issue within black and brown communities too, because it seems to be borrowing more from the Giuliani way of doing things than from, let's say, the David Dinkins way. And by the way, the reduction in crime during the Giuliani years had more to do with Dinkins putting in place a strong community policing, something like what the mayor was talking about. There was really great community policing put in place by Dinkins, and then he lost, and Giuliani inherited that, plus he inherited the COPS program, meaning that there was 100,000 new police officers put on the street. New York got a good share of that additional force. So, I mean, in the gun issue, there's always going to be imperfect allies, right? I mean, whatever people think about Bloomberg on all of these other issues, if he is willing to spend money and the kind of money he has, I mean, he was just on that Forbes rich list again, he's got the resources, you almost have to take the allies where you can. And I will exit on this point. I was just in Mississippi. The First Lady did this Let's Move tour, and I had to go on as in the pool. So the whole pool was waiting for her. It was just outside of Jackson, Mississippi. I'd never been to Mississippi, never thought I'd ever go to Mississippi, had planned never to go to Mississippi, but I was in Mississippi. And I'm sitting there next to this guy who was sitting next to me, just like where the senator is sitting, and he turns out to be this, he's a Republican, both a dentist and a newspaper reporter. It's very weird. He's a dentist, but he and his wife bought this is how small the town was. They bought the local town newspaper. They bought the local town newspaper when it went defunct because they realized their community needed a newspaper. So we started talking about the gun issue and going to, I thought it was brilliant what you said about getting into the other person's shoes. We start talking about guns. And he's sort of saying the same thing. You guys from New York don't understand us. And he said, look, the reality is, he's like, I personally, this is him speaking, did not own guns, didn't really care about guns. I was an outdoors person, but wasn't really into guns. But as soon as Barack Obama came in, and all of this fear, all of my neighbors, everybody was saying, look, this guy's gonna take our guns away. The first thing I did, this is him talking, was go out and start buying them. And as soon as the debate started going to the AR-15, I went in and bought like 3 of them. And he was like, I went out and bought these because just myself, they became a collector's item. They became a valuable commodity. He's like, what you guys don't understand, the debate you're having is just driving up the value of these guns. So a lot of people are just buying because they're seen as valuable because they think they might be scarce. They might actually disappear off the market. So they're just buying them literally just for their financial value. So I think a lot of times that is the kind of person, but he also said he thought it was absolutely reasonable that people should have a background check, that you shouldn't just be able to buy them if you have issues. He said mental illness, which unfortunately has become a crutch for people. But on a lot of issues, we ended up agreeing. We had a great conversation. We ended up exchanging cards. And he was the type of person who we started out like on way opposite sides, but that would be the kind of ally that you would need in this debate, because he was one of those people who statistically was a hoarder, like he's buying all these guns. So if you just described him, this guy from Mississippi, Republican, conservative, you would think this is not an ally, but he actually was. So I think Bloomberg is a similar situation. If you just add up Bloomberg on all of the issues, you may not agree with all of them, but he is an ally in the gun control debate.
If nothing else comes of this panel tonight, can we all agree to stop arming the dentists. Maybe.
The dentists are dangerous, right?
Yeah, maybe Lauren's next piece can be people shot in the molar or something like that. Mayor?
I want to defend my fellow mayor, just real briefly. I did mention this is about counting votes and it's about politics. So the reason why Mayors Against Illegal Guns have done all this polling and all this research is it comes up, we can get 3 things done. Okay, we can get the background checks and the anti-trafficking passed, we think. We can get the assault weapon ban, that's going to be tough, but that's worth the fight. And we can get the large capacity clips. You got to focus, we can't be all over the place. You know, those are the 3 things we think we can get done. And if it weren't for Mike Bloomberg, this debate would never have been as far as it is. You know, sometimes distance makes the heart grow fonder. I have never worked with a mayor like Mike Bloomberg. I think you're very lucky to have him. He can stand up and speak truth to power because he's independently wealthy and is his own guy. And isn't that something we need in this country, is somebody like that? So he's been a good friend to many, many mayors trying to track to a pragmatic middle where we can get things done. You know, if you're real close to him, I'm sure you can find a few warts. But from Bridgeport, Connecticut, he looks pretty damn good.
Okay, we've got a question at the very end there. Yes, yeah.
So I was at an event a couple months ago. It was like a Martin Luther King event with Brooklyn Borough President Marty Markowitz, and he made a comment about how gun control policies, something that we need to do is keep guns in the hands of people who should have them, which is law enforcement. And this is sort of going off the stop and frisk question, but it struck a really uncomfortable chord in a community that's had to deal with a lot of issues of police brutality and police shootings. And that's something that I've come up a lot. That's come up a lot in this conversation. So I'm just curious how you see we could broaden this conversation to not only look at gun violence within communities of color, but also gun violence at the hands of law enforcement.
The only way that you're going to have stop and frisk work is if you have really good community policing and you hire from within your community. I give preference points in the hiring for people from Bridgeport, and we recruit very heavily in the African American community. It has its own set of problems, but it's worth the effort. We make a big extra effort in recruiting that way. And if you don't have a police department that is of the community, that relates to the community, and is from the community, and looks like the community, it's very difficult to effectively use stop and frisk as a tool. And community policing is really the thing you have to do.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because I lived in Miami for a long time. I have a lot of friends that are in the police force down there. And one of the things you have to realize too is that some of the violence from police to civilians has to do with fear. I mean, there are communities in Florida, 1 in 17 Floridians is armed with a concealed carry permit. Pulling somebody over for speeding in Florida is dangerous if you're a police officer. And you know, I have a godbrother that's an NYPD, retired NYPD officer. If you look at the mentality of the vast majority of police who aren't out there stalking the community trying to hurt people, they just want to go home at the end of the day. They don't want to die in the course of just doing their job, and they have this high risk of death. The way to reduce the amount of police on civilian shootings is to reduce the violence within the communities they're policing. Because if people aren't afraid that the community that they're supposed to be protecting and serving is liable or potentially liable to shoot them, think about going into a closed door and you have to kick down that door and you don't know what's on the other side. At this point, most police departments aren't buying lots of new guns. They still have 9mm pistols. The civilian population, just taking Miami as an example, the now gun of choice among gangs down there is an AK-47. I don't know if any of you have ever served in the military. My brother served in the Army National Guard. An AK-47 is a war weapon. If you're a cop with a 9mm, you have no chance of surviving. People have, I mean, the amount of firepower that's on the streets, and in some urban communities, literally, you know, kids are afraid to go to school in some of these communities. Not trying to make the sort of apocalyptic scenario sound real, but there are communities where, and it has to do a lot with mental health. There's a lot going on in communities that people aren't addressing. Poverty and the violence, and you have a lot of people coming out of prison situations who can't get jobs, who are just on the street, high dropout rates. There are a lot of communities, and it's not just communities of color, but there are a lot of communities where there's so much going on. Police can't deal with all of that. You don't have the mental health resources happening. You just don't have a holistic approach. So then you take a cop that may not live in that neighborhood and put him in that mix, you're just asking for trouble, and you're creating more potential violence. So the communities that are smart do community policing so that people know, you know, the young people that they're dealing with, they at least know who they belong to, who's their parents, who is their family, so that they can sort of deal with it in a more holistic way. Otherwise, we'd better get more mental health resources, anti-poverty resources, and deal with these communities so that we're not afraid of the police.
Let me ask really quickly, is there anybody that has an arts or or mental health question? Please, in the back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Matt, and I'm a grad student at the NYU Silver School of Social Work. I'm currently working in East New York juvenile justice program, and I work with youth 12 to 17 years old, many who may have gun possession charges, many who may also have mental health diagnoses. But my question is for our psychiatrist on the panel. If you can help us understand the changes to the new DSM-5 and how that may help impact a larger database of diagnosed individuals who may not then be able to have guns. Alan Francis, a psychiatrist at Duke University, wrote in December about the DSM-5 as a guide but not a Bible. So it's my hope that many mental health professionals will sort of reject some of these new changes in some ways in their practice, but perhaps you can help us understand a little bit.
We have two psychiatrists on the panel, and neither one want to answer your question.
I think that's another panel. My only answer, my best answer to that is it's noise. It's all noise. Most emotional distress, especially that's dangerous, is readily findable without fancy terms, and can be dealt with with that kind of language. So all of that is noise.
And maybe I'll add to that. I glassed over my slides a little bit, but the book that I just finished was a book called The Protest Psychosis, and it looked at how anxiety about social protest actually changed psychiatric criteria particularly for schizophrenia, but particularly for the assumption that people with schizophrenia were violent. And so while all of this social protest was happening, 1967, 1968, there were all these debates about the Black Panthers and who was going to be armed. 1968, the DSM-2 comes out, and lo and behold, the DSM-2 criteria for paranoid schizophrenia had hostile and aggressive attitude and projected anger as part of the criteria. And all of a sudden, what I show in the project is a lot of these Black Power protesters start getting diagnosed with schizophrenia all of a sudden afterwards. And so there is a relationship, and I've interviewed people who worked on the DSM, and they all said, we just wanted to help people. We're thinking what was happening, but there is a relationship between all kinds of diagnosis, but particularly mental health diagnosis. And so understanding the role of the community is, for me, what it's all about, because these diagnostic codes become written in stone in a way that become codified, and you don't see how 10 years later they're still having this effect of, and I'm wondering what's going to happen with the DSM-5 with guns. I've been thinking about this a lot, so I think it's a great question. Let's get an arts question. Dalton? Mental health and mental health and guns. And race, please.
What happened, this is really for Joy, what happened in the 80s, do you think, first of all, to shift why did the Ronald Reagans of the right go from wanting to keep weapons out of the hands of angry black schizophrenics, in Jonathan's terms, to wanting to have a free flow of weapons everywhere? Is it just the gun industry, but something had to change underlying to make that message resonate and shift the political strategies? And then secondary to that, or corollary to that, would be this new black spokesperson for the NRA. Should we encourage that? Because then whites will activate their racist fears again back from the 60s, and then
they'll find more guns.
In a very perverse way, help gun control?
They're going to buy more guns as a result of that. Yeah.
As a result of him? There's a great article in The Atlantic, if you could pull up. It's really, really long, but you should try to find it. I don't remember the name of it, but I'll try to find it and maybe tweet it to this hashtag later, where they talked about after the Mulford Act, when Ronald Reagan really went after the Black Panthers in California, when a lot of rural white Southerners saw that happen, it triggered an alarm. They said, wait a minute, they're trying to confiscate those guys' guns out in LA. This could reverberate on us. It really caused a lot of rural gun owners to be alarmed because they actually saw government regulation of firearms carrying in public, and it really did set off alarms. And it, you know, during the sort of between the 60s and the 80s, you did see this big shift of Democratic-leaning populations toward the Republican Party. So this became an increasingly galvanizing conservative issue. And so local politicians, it bubbled up to people running for Congress, and it bubbled up to Ronald Reagan. By the time he ran for president, you had this shift where rural people who before had no real opinion on gun control were very anti-gun control by 1980, in part because of what was happening in LA. So it's ironic that it really was the Black Panthers, kind of anti-Black Panther regulation, that kind of triggered this move. And at the same time, you had a change in the legal community and the legal thinking around the Second Amendment, where it used to be generally acknowledged that it didn't contain an individual right to carry. In the 80s, you did have a shift in the legal thinking too. So even at the law school level, people started to shift from the mass-carrying militia model to the individual right to bear arms. And ironically, that's because when the Black Panthers were fighting the Mulford Act, what the Black Panthers argued in court was that they had an individual right to bear arms. They actually innovated this idea of the individual right to carry. So ironically enough, that sort of reverberated with a lot of Southern, now Republicans, and it was a sort of a snowball effect. And as far as Conn Noir, we're trying to figure out his real name and who he really is. And so at the Griot, I'm trying to get him to do an interview with me, hopefully next week. I don't know. He's very popular on the right at the moment. He's a star.
And you have an arts question. Please, thank you.
Arts and people's voice question. So I was wondering for artists and our artist politician on the panel, I'm a student, I'm an artist, and I was just wondering what your suggestions are for young people to have a voice in our government and our society and community at large.
I think what artists' gifts, we have ideas. We have ideas all day long. I mean, people are always amazed at the amount of ideas that artists have. We have these genesis of things that happen. That's how beautiful buildings are built, and that's how pieces are, scripts are written, and clothing is drawn. And that's our gift to the world. Just have an idea, and then just follow through. I mean, that's the next part of it. So that's your job as an artist, is to cultivate these ideas and let them grow, and then send them out into the world. And everybody, Twyla Tharp always says to me, everybody else is going to judge your work, so don't take a second about judging an idea. Just do the idea. Let everybody else do it. Don't edit, just do it. Everyone else will do that for you.
And Lauren, can you say what resistance you might find to that? In other words, who do you think is going to push back against your?
Everybody, because everybody is sort of, everybody has an opinion about an idea. So even when I did this flash mob, what if there's opposition there and they're screaming, what if it snows? Well, what if it was raining the day before? So I said, well, if it rains, we're doing it anyway. We're going to have black umbrellas. It'll look like a New Orleans funeral. It'll be actually stunning in a different way, and we'll film the chalk getting washed away. But there were so many people who said, oh, rain date, it's a bad idea, or, there will always be opposition to your idea. You just have to follow through. Somebody else said, well, maybe you should just make it a placard so it's more permanent. And I said, no, that's not what I want to see. So trust your vision, trust yourself. The New York Times will, they'll have an opinion.
Senator, you want to jump in on the arts?
Well, there's really, I've always believed that there isn't that big a gulf between artistic thought and political thought. And if you look at the history of art and the history of artists and playwrights and poets and so on, there's been a lot of crossover, and they've been the inspiration of many politicians, and in many ways artists are sometimes inspired by a political movement or some sort of political struggle that's happening. So it may seem counterintuitive that you might think these worlds are so far apart, but actually they're a lot closer than you think. So you needn't abandon one to be part of the other, and I sure didn't. When I was working in the arts, and I really had a disdain for politicians, and sometimes I still do, depending on the issue. And but then I started realizing that there's actually a lot of room for change, and maybe we need younger folks to run for office. When I ran when I got elected to city council, I was 28. And at that time, I think I was the youngest, or one of the youngest, and when I came to the Senate, I was 32, and at that time, I was the youngest senator. And it actually was, it was, I think, an important thing for the Senate at that time, but I think there should be a lot more younger folks who are, whether artistically inclined or politically inclined, to get involved in government.
Can I give one piece of advice? from somebody, probably Jose could also say this. If you want to run for office, just be very careful of what you say. The press is becoming increasingly hostile, especially on the local level. We live in a gotcha society. They want to sell newspapers by embarrassing you if they can. So if you want to run for office, you got to be a little bit more careful. If you don't, then you should be the artist and
Academic.
And an academic. And just be careful, because politics is different today than it was when I was younger.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to go through, and I'm going to ask the panelists to summarize. But why don't we do this? I know there are a couple questions, so why don't we just have a wave of questions? We're just going to compile some questions. So why don't we start with the one over there? Why don't we just kind of pile up maybe 4 or 5 questions, and then I'm going to ask everybody on the panel just to give some summary comments. So would you mind starting with the first question?
Sure, thank you. My question is part of mental health. I'm a social worker. I actually live in New Jersey. I came here because I was really interested in this topic. And I've worked in social services for a number of years, since '94. And I've been an administrator for programs where I've worked with children like this gentleman back here that had gun violence charges. And my concern is this, because I know that a lot of the children that I've worked with were probably handling illegal guns. However, my concern is for those persons who are getting guns who do have mental health diagnoses. And as a social worker, that concerns me, because sometimes it feels as though, is there a way that they can possibly screen persons? It might not have happened for the Newtown case where the mom was the registrar of the guns. However, the Aurora case, that gentleman had a mental health history. So is there a way that they could possibly do a screening for people who have mental health history before they give them guns?
Great, and we're just going to keep going. So there was this woman here right next to you.
I'm just wondering what each of you think is the message that is productive that someone is ready to hear. And now I have the mic.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what is the most productive message that we can convey? I'm studying data science and data visualization, so a very nerdy artist type maybe. So that's something I'm particularly interested in, is the message that we can move forward with.
Great, the message. Yes?
Sort of just an observation, but as I look around and hear you guys talk, I sort of am under the impression that we're all sort of in agreement right now. So I guess, I studied jazz music. We have an artist here. And I feel like most of our audiences are also probably in agreement. So I guess, how do you recommend we kind of go to the other side and point out that, in fact, what they're arguing is actually wrong, because we have a graph right here,
Come to Nashville. Right in the front here, yeah?
I was very struck by Lauren's comment that it's a very fine line between being capable of committing gun violence and not, and you don't, and also by Dr. Belkin saying that we are mentally ill, and then also Mayor Finch's comment that we will never get rid of guns. And those seem sort of like opposite ideas. You sort of mentioned the idea that if something can be so destructive, it should not exist. Better to come in with a sword and a whip, somewhat. So I'm just curious about your response to that.
Great, maybe just a couple more, please.
I just wanted to say, back to Mayor Bloomberg, I think he has created too many problems. I am a housing activist, and I talk in front of the Rent Guidelines Board, where he has appointed all people in the finance industry to regulate rents, we have more homelessness now. I just heard reports that there are more families now in the homeless shelters. Now, if this doesn't make children angry, people in general angry who are put into this situation, I don't know, and anger can lead to lots of violence. And so much for Mayor Bloomberg.
Well, let me just stop you. We have time for, I just want to make sure we get in time for 2 more questions, so thank you. Just 2 more, the woman in the red there.
Hi. I was just curious if maybe Dr. Belkin or whoever could speak to kind of this idea of how mental illness and the stigma on mental illness is just, it's clearly becoming a huge issue because of this and because of, for many other reasons, but how we kind of as young people, as artists, as academics, can really focus in on the idea of the stigma that's being placed around mental illness and kind of normalizing the fact that so many of us are struggling with mental illness or disorder on varying degrees. So kind of what is the conversation that we can be having as academics, artists, and around that?
Great. And we have time for 2 more. The 2 women back in the corner there.
My question is for Miss Laura. It's about music. So I understand that everybody likes to listen to music, but do you think the history of music, especially during the 90s and even till this present day, do you think it has an influence on why violence is such a big impact on us? I mean, if we think about, the issues of like Tupac and Biggie and how, they had such a big raft or riffle, all that. Yeah. Do you think that could possibly be a big influence on the youth today on why we feel the need to use concealed weapons to protect ourselves?
Thank you so much. Wonderful points. The very last one in the back there.
My question is just that after the NRA's ad towards the Obama girls and their protection at school, specifically for Mr. Finch, how do you guys feel about having armed guards and police officers, increased police officers at schools?
Terrific. Well, thank you all. Wonderful questions. I feel like there are many more out there. What we're going to do is we're going to start in reverse order. So we'll start with Gary.
I didn't expect that.
And you get, and you just get a quick little bullet point here to summarize, touch on any of these points.
Okay, just first, since we're in the Institute for Public Knowledge, right? Okay, is just to make the observation that I gave this whole talk about sort of deconstructing psychiatry and mental health and making it more, out to the people, and everyone's calling me doctor, so I don't know whether. I'm going to answer the question about screening and about stigma, and then also about the public message, which gets to your worry of, are we talking about opposite things that can never reconcile? So about screening and stigma, we touched on this in the discussion, but I think the problem with screening out folks with a mental health history to buy guns is you have to do that, you need a registry of people who've had a mental health history. And that's where it gets kind of weird, is, okay, so who goes on that registry? Anybody, how do you define that? And it just gets very entangled, especially when, for mass killings, you're talking about, enrolling 1 million people in a registry for an event that happens, relatively rarely. So it becomes a very complicated issue. What I'm interested, the only slightly positive thing I could say about the recent New York State law in creating a registry, which may deter a lot of people from seeking mental health care because they may go on a registry, even if they have no interest in buying a gun, is that the only value of doing that is it might reduce the rate of successful suicides, which no one talks about as the reason, but actually is the only sensible possible way to think about that, because it gets to the key public message that I'm going to address in a second. So that's about screening, and stigma is. I don't talk about stigma a lot. It's a real issue because I think stigma is a red herring issue. I think stigma fills a vacuum where there are bad solutions, and so let's work about things that work, about making mental health care normal, as easy to get as a flu shot, reimagine how to distribute in communities, and you're going to have less stigma. So I don't worry about stigma so much as an issue of itself. I think it wastes energy and creativity about making better delivery solutions. The public message question, what would be the soundbite? To me, it's guns make you less safe. And I think that undermines a fundamental assumption on the other side. It has the benefit of actually being empirically true. And it points the way to potential solutions that get at your fear that we're just at irreconcilable odds, which is that it points the way towards strategies of harm reduction. So they make you less safe. Can we make them safer? Like we make cars safer and planes safer. We don't stop using them. We try to make them We try to toys safer. There are more regulations about, those Nerf, things you can shoot than there are about revolvers. So I think that can move a direction that makes empirical sense and gets back to your question about screening. If we're going to have registries, we're going to screen, it should at least have a purpose of reducing harm, not just putting stigmatized people on a list.
Great. Lauren, speed dating?
I think the word I'd like to sort of impart is inclusivity. And this idea that, I mean, for me, I'm no expert, but it seems like mental health is going in the right direction. I mean, young kids today are, who have, there was no such thing as Asperger's, or we didn't have a word for it. If Jimmy had that, we didn't know what it was. I live in a world as an artist where racism, it's not an issue. There's LGBT, we live in this sort of fantastical world where Romeo and Juliet, race isn't even an issue anymore on Broadway. We're sort of 10 years ahead of the rest of the world, I feel like, with these kinds of issues. So I'd like to sort of impart that to everybody else. And the other thing about inclusivity is this idea of trying to stop doing this and sit and from this exercise is think about the fact that the nation is collectively feeling loss of this being able to procure an object and loss of lives. And how can we convince everybody as a nation that collectively one loss is of course greater than the other, but yet validate the sense of loss and understand. And so I feel like maybe this is, inclusivity is sort of the word I want to leave with. And about the music, look, I believe in physical empathy. As a dancer, that's the realm I live in. I believe in sort of synaptic, neurogenesis, and these things affect our brains. Music affects me very, very deeply as a dancer. The way I move, it changes everything about me. It's a very spiritual thing for me, and it releases serotonin and all these other things from a neuroscience perspective. Yes, I do believe it all has something to do with it, because when words are put into your brain, they stay in your brain. So I do believe that.
Mayor?
In order to pursue happiness, we have to be safer. In order to be safer, we have to restrict the use of guns, and we have to have fewer guns. How do you get to have fewer guns and have them used less? You have to have better laws. Mayors Against Illegal Guns are trying to eliminate gun trafficking. Senator Schumer's bill is in committee. It's doing very, very well. You need to support Senator Schumer and his bill, because trafficking and background checks are important. The woman over here, the social worker, asked, she works with youth, most of the guns in the cities were not purchased legally. So 40% of the guns in the United States are purchased illegally. They're purchased legally, but without a background check. You follow me? And a background check doesn't just check for people who are mentally ill. It primarily checks for people who have felonies, who are on stalkers lists, who are domestic violence. So these laws have to be beefed up. Senator Schumer, Mayors Against Illegal Guns are doing that. We need to reduce the number of bullets in a clip so that you can't have mass carnage, and we need to eliminate the assault weapons. And to do that, we'll all be safer. We can all pursue happiness, and we can pursue the end of this panel.
I'll be quick too. I mean, on the music thing, they listen to as much hip hop in Japan and other countries as they do in the U.S. The difference between those countries and here, they have the same video games, watch the same movies. Django is playing all over the world, not just here. The difference is we have just more guns and more access to them, and so there's no way to get around the argument you have to deal with the guns. On the mental health issue and on the other issues, and on talking to the other side, politically, the way this is going to work is that you have to offer the other side something. You just can't tell them that they're wrong. And you have to start with the presumption that the Second Amendment, as the mayor said, isn't going anywhere, that no one wants to take you, lawful gun owner, no one wants to take your guns. We just want to make sure that someone who might threaten you and that you might fear doesn't have a gun if they shouldn't have one. And I think a lot of people are coming to an agreement on the idea of at least somehow marrying a database of, let's say, people who've been convicted of domestic violence with the gun registry, or marrying some of the mental health databases. It has to be done right, but you aren't going to get anywhere if you don't give the other side something. One of the things they want is this idea of armed guards in schools. If that's something that cities can afford and that they want, rather than saying no, 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 maybe there's a way to work with individual mayors who want it. Politics is ugly and messy when you look at the way it's put together, but it won't happen if the other side doesn't feel invested and doesn't get something. So we're gonna have to find a way not to just talk to people in this room who all agree, but to have a conversation with the other side that's respectful, but that also is firm in the things that we know work, which is reducing access to high magazine clips, reducing access to guns to people who couldn't pass a background check. And I think almost every hunter agrees with that.
Just wanted to jump off 3 issues that were raised in the questions. The mental health component in the Cuomo law that we all passed on the state level is probably the worst component. And I know that you said that. There are many other components about regulating the size of a magazine clip and so on, but the mental health component is clearly the weakest link within this law, because as Gary mentioned, it sort of violates a trust that you're supposed to have with your therapist, and it's going to reduce access to health care. It's going to make people less likely to open up, and it's also going to be putting therapists in a horrible position of sort of having to determine whether the person in front of them is a risk and they need to be reported or not. So I think that's just, and there's only 4% of the population that get involved in gun crimes are people who are mentally ill. The Mayor Bloomberg, and as the mayor said, Mayor Bloomberg has done a tremendous job in finding common ground and sort of expanding the discussion beyond people like ourselves who are all in agreement. 120 mayors throughout New York State are part of Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and that's Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever, as well as folks outside the state. So he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's helping to finance and bankroll candidates regardless of political affiliation if they do the right thing on this issue. And I think that's been extremely effective. And finally, I think there was a question here about guns, and as far as more guns sort of being the answer. And that seems to be the response by the right, has been, well, if we have more guns, or the NRA, if we have more guns, we'll cut down. It's almost like the nuclear arms race. If we have our bombs and you have your bombs, then we won't blow up one another. But it's very different. It's very different when you're considering handguns or assault weapons and so on. And I read, and I'm not sure if it was South Dakota, but the governor signed into law allowing teachers to have handguns, to have guns in classrooms. So again, it's just this escalation. Where does it end? It's like, the whole, where it's like the arms race. Where does it end? More guns are not the answer.
And I'll just conclude with three closing points. And one is just linking up to just reinforcing what we're saying about the mental health angle, which is that psychiatric diagnosis is not a predictive science. So you could send 10,000 people to a psychiatrist. I mean, we've seen the data already, that people who fit the profile of mass shooters, psychiatrists can't figure out, but the tiny minority of people who are white, paranoid, gun-owning, fit, every one of the criteria, psychiatrists can't pick out which people of that are going to be. So it's, in a way, it's a community issue. It's not a diagnostic issue. So I can't say how powerful I think that is. The second, my students at Vanderbilt think I'm crazy, but I'm trying to do a project where I go into bars, because in Nashville, actually, you can have a loaded gun in a bar. And I want to see not just about like who shoots anybody. I want to see like how that changes people's like pickup lines when they talk to each other and stuff. Because I think that we of course we're focusing on the shootings and all that kind of stuff, but it's actually the day-to-day interactions, not just the pickup, but other kind of things where as a society, there's this kind of edge of mistrust. Do we want that kind of society where if you're in a bar or somebody's saying something and you say no, they're going to shoot you? So in other words, it's kind of like what are the secondary effects of guns beneath the shooting? What kind of society does that create in terms of just the edge around interpersonal interactions? And I think the schools are the same thing, that in a way it's kind of like, what kind of society are we building? And I don't think the arms race is a good model for the kind of society we want. And the third point is that I'm going to disagree on the assumption that we all agree, and that I think we all agree maybe from a political vantage point on this yes or no guns thing, but we're coming at this point from very different disciplinary perspectives. And so I again just want to applaud the panel for really talking across their normal comfort zones in what I think is a very productive and exciting interdisciplinary conversation. So once again, thank you all so very much.